we need to talk about Rachel Hollis. Again. My last video about her was put out over a year ago, but she continues to annoy me with her rules for the not for me mentality. On February 12th of this year, Rachel Hollis's ex-husband Dave died suddenly at the age of 47. And I'm not here to snark on that. It is truly tragic that his 4 kids lost their dad and his family lost their son and brother. And while Rachel is historically a bit of an oversharer, all of her books are, after all about her, I actually think she's handled this really well from a PR perspective. Especially because, unfortunately, anti-vaxxers chose to use Dave's death to further their agenda, even though there's no reason to think that the COVID vaccine or COVID itself had any effect on his health or death. Rachel has pretty much stayed quiet on her social media and her YouTube since Dave died, and all of her podcasts have been pre-recorded material. Her first new picture on her Instagram reads, "We are devastated. I have no words and my heart is too broken to find them. Please wrap the kids up in prayers as we try to navigate through the unthinkable." Great. And given the anti-vaxxer bullshittery, she very wisely turned off the comments. And honestly, after a big tragedy like this, even comments that are loving and supportive can be too much to handle right away. Then on February 27th, Rachel posted something on her podcast feed that gave me a little pause. It was basically just a short note telling people that the family is obviously shattered, but the kids are doing as well as can be expected. And in the beginning, she says, "I'm going to make this episode and then I'm not going to talk about this anymore because my children's father isn't content for other people. His death is traumatic and awful and it's devastating and it's not content. I found that grotesque and deeply disrespectful." And she's absolutely right. And aside from the anti-vaxxer bullshit, I think she may be referring to an email blast about his passing sent out by Mel Robbins to all of her followers in an email blast. And then in another email blast when Mel talks about giving one of the memoriam speeches at Dave's funeral, and using both of those email blasts to clumsily direct people to go listen to a podcast episode of hers that's not about Dave or death. The emails would have been just as serviceable without talking about her recently deceased friend. And friend might even be pushing it. I think they were more like coworkers. The only reason for her to mention him at all is to use the tragedy to draw people in. But as usual, take something that Rachel Hollis says and then take the quickest of peeks at her canon, and you'll find her saying or doing the exact opposite. In this case, on June 18th, 2021, Rachel released an episode of her podcast called "I Don't Believe in Coincidences." She opens by saying she's going to do something she's never done before and give a trigger warning for death and suicide. But a few seconds later, make sure to add that, quote, "You know me, it's not going to be negative or too sad. You're talking about death, Rachel, it's okay for the episode to be sad." She then describes the scene. She was on her morning 10-mile run. She makes sure to bring up how long the run was, 4 times, and comes across a scene involving police, paramedics, and a man who, according to her, is dead. And based on her opinion of something that she can sort of see from a couple hundred feet away, she creates the story of what was going on. There's a group of maybe 12 first responders, and one of them is doing chest compressions on someone, and the rest are just watching. And what I'm looking at is this young paramedic who's trying so hard to revive someone who is no longer with us. And I'm watching the other first responders who are just sort of we're gonna let this kid try even though there's no hope. And I watched this human literally try to give their energy and their life force to someone else to try and give it with they couldn't see that it was hopeless. They couldn't see that there was no chance. The other people who were standing around, the older people, the ones who had maybe been through this before, they all knew. Rachel, how could you possibly know that in this situation there was no hope? First, you're assuming that because the paramedic is young, he has no idea when CPR is useless. You can become an EMT at 18 and it involves training, so this kid could have been 24 and had years of experience as a paramedic, which is way more than your 0. But I'm sure that even if this young EMT didn't know when it was useless, his fellows would and would tell him what to do. Or are they gonna let him do chest compressions for the next 12 hours? So Rachel crafts this whole unproven story about why this man is getting medical attention, and then says that the reason that this man needed medical attention was because of her. And not because Rachel caused this man's medical issues, but before Rachel tanked her career on this very app, she constantly preached the idea that life is happening for you, not to you. So if you miss your flight, the universe decided that that was the thing that needed to happen. You had to leave work early because your kid got sick at school. The universe knew that you had to spend some quality time with him. And if you've been slacking on having deep thoughts lately, the universe will kill a guy to force you to think deeply. And don't get me wrong, I don't think it's a problem to see a tragic scene like that and use it to reflect on your own life. What I have a problem with is 1, thinking that the scene happened because you had to do that reflection, and 2, using that incident for content. She says, "Since this happened, I'm asking myself why I saw that, because I don't believe in coincidence at all. I think we walk into or experience whatever was set up in our lives, and I'm like, okay, what is the lesson? Because there's gotta be a lesson in this." Or maybe there's not, Rachel. Maybe he was having health issues and they just all came to a head while he was on a walk in the park. And are you saying that if you had decided to not go on your morning run that day, he would have gotten home just fine? And as Rachel has talked about, she has PTSD involving paramedics and such. So you're telling me that the universe had to re-traumatize you to teach you a lesson. It couldn't have caused you to reflect while you were reading a book or something? You had to see another person in distress? That's pretty shitty of the universe. Then, much like Mel did with Dave's death, Rachel uses this lesson that she learned as a jumping off point to say that sometimes some things in life are just hopeless, and it's better to throw in the towel and give up, whether that be a relationship, a job, whatever. But considering that a year before that podcast episode dropped, Rachel had announced her divorce from Dave, she could have used her divorce as a way to talk about knowing when to call something quits. And of course, she doesn't have to speak about her divorce if she doesn't want to, but it's kinda shitty to use a stranger's possible last moment as, content. And as much as I don't like Rachel, she is an intelligent, creative person. She could have found a better way to talk about this idea without talking about that guy. My other problem with her using that story is, what if the man's family were listeners of Rachel's podcast? I know some of you might not know who Rachel is, but she is famous enough that a couple months ago her podcast hit 100 million downloads. And that was just after a few years of production. And even a casual listener knows that she lives in the Austin, Texas area. So imagine this man's wife or sister or daughter are sitting at his hospital bedside as he recovers from that park incident, because we don't actually know if he died or not, and decides to pass the time by listening to the Rachel HOLLIS podcast, and holy shit, she's telling the story of my brother, husband's, dad's collapse in the park. That would be, as Rachel said last month, grotesque and deeply disrespectful. And of course, when she released that episode, Dave was still alive. She had no idea what was going to happen in the next year and a half. But still, Rachel is smart enough to think through the repercussions of using a stranger's tragedy on her popular podcast. And this is a pattern for Rachel. In her first book, Girl Wash Your Face, Rachel invents a fictional coworker for the reader named Pam. Rachel mocks Pam because Pam is fat, and she said that she was going to do Whole30, but then she had a bite of cake at her son's birthday party and she just figured fuck it. And Rachel writes that if someone doesn't have the drive to stick to a diet, they can't be trusted in any area of life. She also obsesses about weight and diet on every platform she is active on. That book came out in 2018, and Rachel continued to use the Pam story on stage at her many events, in addition to heavily mocking people who get divorced. And despite the fact that now saying that she believes all bodies are beautiful, and despite the fact that she is now divorced herself, she has yet to, if not apologize, take back what she said in that book and on that stage. It would be so simple for her to release a podcast episode or write an Instagram post that says, "We all go through so many changes. Here's the list of things that I have said publicly that I no longer believe." Because it's not like she hasn't done that about other stuff. In Girl Wash Your Face, she talks about her decision to leave the church that she went to in LA because they preached homophobia and 2 of her friends came out as gay. So why can't she own up to her other stuff? It's been almost 2 years since Toiletgate, and Rachel has yet to apologize for her racist, classist, and allegedly drunk TikTok rant. And nothing is stopping her from addressing the fact that a year and a half ago, she too used someone else's death for content.